Severomorsk, Russia, late autumn 1941. In a small cemetery overlooking the docks of the Soviet Northern Fleet, 5 black granite headstones stand surrounded by carefully groomed gravel and wrought iron fencing. Each stone bears a British or Commonwealth name, each one marking the grave of an airman who died thousands of miles from home in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. These graves tell a story that history has largely forgotten, a story of sworn enemies becoming allies, of fighter pilots battling in Arctic conditions so extreme that fuel froze in the lines and engines seized in mid-flight, and of a mission so unusual that when it ended, the participants received the highest civilian honor the Soviet Union could bestow. This is the story of Operation Benedict, when the Royal Air Force went to war in the Russian Arctic, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered. The summer of 1941 changed everything. For years, Britain and the Soviet Union had been adversaries separated by ideology and mutual distrust. The British had even intervened in the Russian Civil War after World War I, attempting to topple the newly formed Bolshevik government. Though Britain eventually recognized the Soviet Union in 1924, relations remained icy. The Soviets viewed the British with suspicion, and the British regarded communism with open hostility. Then came June 22, 1941, the day Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, his massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Overnight, the strategic landscape transformed. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite his well-known aversion to communism, made a radio broadcast that very evening pledging Britain's support to the Soviet Union. He declared that any man or state fighting against Nazi Germany would receive British aid, and that Britain would give whatever help it could to Russia and the Russian people. It was the beginning of one of history's strangest military partnerships, a marriage of convenience born from desperate necessity. Within days, a military delegation was dispatched to Moscow, and the wheels were set in motion for an operation that would send British fighter pilots into the frozen wastelands of the Soviet Arctic. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, never one to accept help without making demands, responded to Churchill's offer on July 18th by insisting that Britain open additional military fronts in northern France and in the Arctic. Churchill had to refuse the first request. Britain simply lacked the resources to launch an invasion of France in 1941. But the Arctic was a different matter. The northern Soviet port of Murmansk had become a critical lifeline for the embattled Red Army, receiving convoy after convoy of desperately needed war supplies from Britain and America. These convoys faced constant attack from German submarines and aircraft based in occupied Norway. Churchill saw an opportunity. He offered to base British fighter squadrons at Murmansk to help protect these vital supply lines. The plan came together quickly. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal created No. 151 Wing specifically for this mission, codenamed Operation Benedict. The wing would consist of 2 fighter squadrons, No. 81 Squadron and No. 134 Squadron, both equipped with Hawker Hurricane fighters, the workhorse of RAF Fighter Command. These squadrons were placed under the command of Wing Commander Henry Neville Guines Ramsbottom-Isherwood, a 35-year-old New Zealander who had proven himself as an exceptional test pilot in the 1930s, earning the Air Force Medal for his accomplishments. Squadron leaders Tony Rook and Tony Miller were assigned to command the 2 squadrons, and the pilots and ground crew were assembled at Leconfield in Yorkshire. Their orders were clear but unusual. They would exercise full operational control while serving under the general command of Major General Kuznetsov, commander of the Soviet Northern Fleet Air Force. Their primary mission was to defend Murmansk and cooperate with Soviet forces in the region. But first, they had to get there, and that journey would prove to be an adventure in itself. On August 12, 1941, The personnel of No. 151 Wing mustered in full uniform and were dispatched by train to Liverpool, where they boarded the former luxury liner Landstephen Castle. But 24 pilots stayed behind for a special assignment. On August 18th, they flew to Abbotssinch Airfield near Glasgow, then transferred by truck to the dockyards where they boarded the escort carrier HMS Argus. Below the flight deck of the Argus, with their wings removed for storage, sat 24 brand-new Hawker Hurricane Mark II-B fighters. The convoy that would carry No. 151 Wing to Russia assembled at Iceland under the code name Operation Dervish. It was the first trial convoy to Arctic Russia, and its cargo was precious. Several aging merchant ships carried wood, rubber, and tin, but buried deep in their holds was the most valuable cargo of all: 15 additional Hurricane fighters, each one packed in an individual crate weighing 5 tons. These 39 Hurricanes would be flown operationally by the British squadrons before being handed over to the Russians. The convoy departed Iceland on August 21st, taking a circuitous route through the Denmark Strait and into the Norwegian Sea. Aware of the threat from German submarines and long-range reconnaissance aircraft, the ships swung far to the north before turning east toward the Soviet coast. When HMS Argus finally reached the launch point, the moment of truth arrived. Squadron Leader Miller of No. 134. Squadron revved up his Hurricane's Merlin engine, released the brakes, and sprinted down the carrier's deck. A Fleet Air Arm officer had warned him to pull back hard when the aircraft reached the sloped launch ramp at the end of the flight deck. Miller did exactly that, and his Hurricane leaped into the air, but in the process he damaged the undercarriage. The next 2 aircraft to launch also struck the ramp, one breaking off a length of propeller. Despite these mishaps, all 24 Hurricanes made it off the carrier and headed toward the Russian mainland. After 20 long minutes flying through fog and clouds, the barren landscape appeared below them. The airfield at Vienga was easy to spot, a large oval of sandy ground with no paved runways or major buildings. Most of the aircraft landed successfully, though 2 Hurricanes with damaged undercarriages collapsed when they touched down. Meanwhile, at Archangel, another drama was unfolding as Flight Lieutenant Harry Gittins and his engineering party faced the daunting task of assembling 15 crated Hurricanes that had been dumped on a mudflat. The British pilots quickly discovered that their new home at Vienga Airfield was unlike anything they had experienced. Located less than 30 miles from the front lines, the base was frequently targeted for German attack. The Russians, in an impressive display of engineering, had dug out massive underground hangars 40 feet wide, erected roofs over them, and covered everything with turf. In a single day, they created 39 of these dugouts, easily accommodating all the Hurricanes. It was an effective solution. Above-ground hangars would have been sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe. The British crews faced numerous challenges. The Hurricanes that flew off the Argus had been fitted with only 6 of their normal 12 Browning machine guns as a weight-saving measure, and additional guns that arrived overland came without their firing and safety mechanisms, rendering them completely useless. An emergency message was sent to the Air Ministry requesting immediate shipment of the necessary parts. Until they arrived, aircraft had to be cannibalized so that at least some fighters could go into combat with 8 functioning machine guns. Then there was the fuel problem. Soviet aviation fuel had a lower octane rating than British fuel, which caused the Merlin engines to foul and cut out during flight. Fortunately, pilots were able to restart their engines in the air, but it was a recurring problem that wouldn't be fully resolved until higher quality fuel arrived. Despite these difficulties, No. 151 Wing began operational sorties from Vienga on September 11, 1941. The 4 flights from both squadrons flew orientation patrols, guided by Russian pilots who showed them the operational area and the front lines. The first major engagement came after the first snowfall, a harbinger of the brutal Russian winter to come. Flight Sergeant Charlton Haw, known to everyone as WAG, led a patrol of 5 Hurricanes from No. 81 Squadron over enemy lines west of Murmansk. They intercepted 5 Messerschmitt 109E fighters escorting a Henschel reconnaissance aircraft. When Haw's flight turned toward them, the German pilots astonishingly turned and fled toward their own lines, taking no evasive action whatsoever. The Hurricanes dove after them. Haw caught the enemy leader in his sights and fired a 10-second burst that left the Messerschmitt in flames. It rolled onto its back and dove into the ground. His wingman, a Canadian pilot officer named Jimmy Walker, spotted an enemy fighter closing in on Haw and pulled in behind it, firing 2 short bursts before the Messerschmitt rolled over and fell toward the ground, pouring smoke. Sergeant Ken Wad, nicknamed Ibby, found the small Henschel reconnaissance plane drifting across his gun sight and gave it a short burst. The German pilot fled but couldn't outrun a Hurricane. Wad overtook him and unleashed another long burst, causing the aircraft to erupt in white smoke. In his excitement, Wad misjudged his closing speed and yanked back on his control stick, narrowly missing the stricken observation plane. After regaining altitude, Wad spotted a Hurricane and a Messerschmitt circling each other, each pilot trying to get into position for a deflection shot. He dove on the German fighter and fired, forcing it to brake for home. As the enemy pilot flew at ground level following a dry riverbed, he made the fatal mistake of not taking evasive action. Wad closed for a 3rd time, carefully lined up his target, and pressed the firing button. The Messerschmitt began smoking, skidded to port, and crashed into the riverbank. Meanwhile, Flight Sergeant Haw had gotten into another tangle with a Messerschmitt, but broke away when he spotted a smoking Hurricane losing altitude rapidly. Diving after it, Haw pulled alongside and saw his friend, Sergeant Norman Smith, known as Nudger, struggling desperately to release the cockpit canopy. A giant hole had been punched through the fuselage behind the cockpit, evidence of German cannon fire. Helpless to intervene, Haw could only watch in horror as his friend's aircraft continued its descent and then broke apart as it impacted the ground. With the skies cleared of enemy aircraft, the surviving Hurricanes made their way back to Vienga. No. 81 Squadron had drawn first blood, destroying 3 enemy aircraft and claiming a probable 4th. It was an auspicious start, but the death of Norman Smith cast a shadow over the victory. The successes continued through late September. On September 17th, Squadron leader Tony Rook led 7 members of 81 Squadron while providing escort cover to Russian Petlyakov dive bombers. As they patrolled near Petsamo, Rook noticed 2 Messerschmitts preparing to attack the bombers. He locked onto the leader and delivered a short burst that hit the enemy's radiator. Leaking coolant smeared Rook's windscreen as he chased the fighter down to ground level. After emptying his machine guns into the aircraft, he broke away to allow other pilots to finish the job. Bullets from both accompanying Hurricanes struck home, and the enemy aircraft disintegrated before plummeting into the ground. In that same engagement, Pilot Officer Bush spotted 6 Messerschmitts diving from above and behind. Turning sharply into the attack, he engaged the nearest aircraft in a deadly turning duel. With its tighter turning radius, Bush's Hurricane steadily gained on the Messerschmitt, finally getting behind it to deliver a long burst that sent it flaming into a hillside. But triumph was once again followed by tragedy, and this time it came not from enemy action but from a terrible accident. On September 27th, German Junkers 88 bombers were spotted approaching Vienga. The airfield was waterlogged from recent snowstorms, with standing water covering the field and most of the dispersal areas. To get through the bog, pilots had to use extra engine power, which required 2 ground crew members to drape themselves over each Hurricane's horizontal stabilizer to keep the nose up and prevent the aircraft from tipping forward. No. 134 Squadron was on readiness that day. When the alarm sounded, Flight Lieutenant Vic Berg dashed to his airplane, fired up the engine, and as soon as the chocks were removed, opened the throttle. Aircraftmen James Ridley and Glanville Thomas had positioned themselves over the tailplane, expecting Berg to taxi to a drier spot before taking off. But Berg suddenly applied full throttle without warning. The two ground crew members were pinned against the tail by the powerful slipstream as the Hurricane roared across the airfield. When Berg pulled back on the throttle after achieving flying speed, his Hurricane rose into the air with both men still desperately clinging to the tail. The aircraft reached an altitude of 60 feet, then stalled, nosed over, and plunged to the ground. It cartwheeled on impact, throwing Ridley and Thomas high into the air. They were killed instantly when they hit the ground. Berg was pulled from the wreckage, unconscious and severely injured. He would eventually wake up in a Russian hospital with no memory of the accident. Ridley and Thomas were buried in plots next to Norman Smith in the cemetery of Soviet heroes overlooking Vanga. A solemn burial party, drawn from the ranks of both the RAF and the Soviet Air Force, fired a final salute as most of the wing looked on. It was a bitter moment for No. 151 Wing. The men were prepared for death at the hands of the enemy, but losing two colleagues in such a tragic accident was devastating. These are three of the 5 graves that still stand today in Severomorsk, silent witnesses to the price paid during this forgotten campaign. While No. 81 Squadron continued to rack up victories in aerial combat, No. 134 Squadron focused primarily on training Russian pilots to fly Hurricanes and teaching Soviet ground crews how to service and maintain them. The training progressed rapidly, though not without challenges. Russian pilots, accustomed to the open cockpits of their Polikarpov fighters, were initially hesitant to fly the Hurricanes with their canopies closed. They also had a habit of not raising the undercarriage after takeoff, and it took a stern warning from General Kuznetsov himself to correct this dangerous practice. By early October, the Russian winter had descended in earnest. Temperatures plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit and then to 15 degrees below zero. Snow blanketed everything, and the cold penetrated every aspect of operations. Pipes and hoses cracked, fuel and lubricants froze, and batteries failed prematurely. Yet the training not only continued, but actually accelerated. On October 12th, No. 81 Squadron turned all of its Hurricanes over to the Russians. No. 134 Squadron flew a few more bomber escort missions involving both RAF and Russian pilots, but on October 19th it delivered all of its planes and equipment to Major General Kuznetsov's forces. No. 151 Wing's time in Russia was drawing to a close. For Wing Commander Ramsbottom-Isherwood, the biggest problem now was keeping his idled airmen occupied. Some took to cross-country skiing and tobogganing, but drinking the low-cost alcohol available in the messes and teaching their Russian colleagues how to play darts proved particularly popular. The evacuation back to Britain began in mid-November and proved to be as challenging as the journey to Russia had been. Violent seas, frozen estuaries, and the constant threat of German submarines made it a harrowing experience. In a final, fitting gesture, a squadron of Hurricanes flown by the Russians, the British had trained, and led by the Soviet ace captain Boris Safonov, passed over the departing convoy and waggled their wings in farewell. On March 31, 1942, Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom Ivan Maysky presented the Order of Lenin to Ramsbottom-Isherwood, Miller, Rook, and Haw, the first foreigners ever to receive the Soviet Union's highest civil decoration. It was a recognition of the unique bond forged between British and Russian airmen in the frozen Arctic. Today, the campaign has been largely forgotten in the Western world, but those 5 black granite headstones in Severomorsk remain as testimony to a remarkable moment in history when sworn enemies became brothers in arms, fighting together in one of the most remote and desolate battlefields of World War II. Their story and their sacrifice deserve to be remembered.